Welcome to Story Planet. Take a deep breath, let go of the day, and settle into the calm embrace of the holiday season. Tonight's story is Healing Home, a tale of returning to your roots, rediscovering the warmth of family, and a Christmas of renewal that heals the heart. So wrap yourself in a cozy blanket, listen to the soft hum of the world around you, and let the spirit of homecoming fill your soul. Now, let's begin. The gentle click-clack of the train wheels on the tracks was a rhythmic lullaby, lulling Maggie Whitmore into a deep, reflective trance. She sat alone in the dimly lit carriage, the window beside her offering a blurred view of the snowy landscape. It was as if the world outside had transformed into a painting, soft, serene, and muted under the weight of winter's embrace. The trees stood bare, their limbs reaching toward the heavens as if longing for something just beyond their grasp. The fields lay still, covered in a blanket of white, the earth beneath them quiet, almost as though it too had retreated into itself for the season. Maggie hadn't been back in so long. The small village she had once called home now seemed like a distant memory, a fading photograph in the back of her mind. It had been decades since she'd left, filled with the fire of youth and the restlessness of adventure. The pull of faraway places, strange cities, and foreign lands had taken her across oceans and continents. She had sought something she hadn't been able to name, something that could never be found in the crowded streets of cities or the deep corners of the world. Now she was returning to the very place she had once run from. The very place she thought she had outgrown. Her hands rested on her lap, clasped tightly together, and she couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled in her chest. Maggie had traveled far and wide, but the village, the place she had grown up, was the one place she hadn't been able to leave behind in her heart. Memories of her childhood home haunted her thoughts as the train clattered along, shaking her out of the disquiet she tried to keep at bay. The laughter of her sister, Beatrice, echoed through her mind, the way she used to scold Maggie for running too fast, the way they would play in the snow until their cheeks were rosy and their fingers numb. Their parents, her mother's warm smile and her father's steady voice, were nothing but echoes now, fading with time. She had left them all behind in pursuit of a life that had never quite satisfied her, never quite filled the hole that was always there. Christmases, though, those memories were sharp and clear. The smell of cinnamon and pine, the warmth of the hearth, the sound of carolers singing in the village square, all held such vividness in her heart. The house, with its crooked roof and ivy-covered walls, was still alive in her memory. She could almost feel the cold stone beneath her feet as she crossed the threshold of the front door, the creak of the wooden floorboards beneath her step. The days when her whole family was together and everything felt like it was in its place. But now, so much had changed. Would it still feel like home? Was she still welcome there, after all these years? Her eyes fluttered closed as the train continued its journey. The hum of the engine and the soft, rhythmic motion rocked her gently, coaxing her into a nap she had long needed but had resisted. As her mind drifted away from the present, she was transported. Back in time. It was as though the train had disappeared. The landscape outside had melted into a memory. Maggie found herself standing in front of the house, the old, familiar house she had left behind. Snowflakes fell softly from the sky, dancing in the air before settling onto the ground, and the lights from the windows glowed warmly against the evening dark. Her heart swelled with an odd mix of comfort and sorrow. She had been gone so long, but somehow it still felt the same. The home she had once known. She could hear the muffled laughter of her younger self and Beatrice running down the hallway of the house. Their voices echoed off the walls, just as they had so many Christmases ago. Their parents were there too, standing by the fire, smiling as they watched their children with pride. Maggie could feel the warmth of her mother's embrace, the steadying presence of her father's hands guiding her through life. The train's gentle motion shifted once more, and the dream intensified, the memories melding into one. She found herself in the kitchen, where the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. Her mother's face appeared before her, smiling softly as she kneaded dough at the table. Beatrice was laughing, showing Maggie a snowball she had just made, ready to hurl it at her. She could hear the crackling fire in the hearth, the comforting hum of her family moving around her, each one contributing to the warmth of the evening. The dream grew more vivid, and Maggie's chest tightened with longing. She had missed this more than she realized. She had spent years chasing something, and yet, here, in the warmth of the memory, she felt a peace she hadn't known she needed. The soft melody of a Christmas carol reached her ears, and in the dream she saw the family gathered around the Christmas tree. The tree, adorned with ornaments, its branches heavy with the weight of the decorations and the sense of Christmas. Her father's deep voice led them in song, while Beatrice, laughing with delight, swirled in circles in front of the tree, her arms wide open. Maggie joined in, her voice blending with the others. The world felt perfect, still, and complete. But then the train jolted, a sudden bump shaking her from the dream. Maggie gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. She opened her eyes. It was no longer the house. The warm kitchen, the laughter, the glow of the fire, everything had faded away. She was sitting in the train once again, the rhythmic hum of the engines soothing her as the familiar station loomed into view. The snow-covered village appeared before her eyes, the station's wooden platform now visible through the window. It was just as it had been in her memory. She blinked, disoriented for a moment, but the train continued its slow approach to the station. She had arrived. The station, though it looked smaller than she remembered, was a welcoming sight. The old town square, just a stone's throw away, was still lined with the same quaint little shops, their windows glowing softly in the winter dusk. The church steeple rose high against the sky, its bells tolling gently as if to announce her return. Maggie's heart fluttered, a mixture of excitement and nervousness rising in her chest. She had arrived in the village of her youth, and though it felt like a dream, it was real. Her heart raced as she stepped off the train, the cold winter air hitting her face like a wave. The crisp scent of snow filled her lungs, and she felt a sense of wonder. She was finally here, after all these years. Beatrice stood waiting for her on the platform, her face beaming with warmth. Maggie saw her sister smile, familiar, loving, and welcoming, and something inside her shifted. The last few decades of travel, of adventures, of life lived in the fast lane felt distant now. In the face of this simple, welcoming village, she felt like she was finally coming home. "Maggie!" Beatrice called out, her voice full of joy. Maggie smiled, her throat tight with emotion. She hadn't realized how much she had missed her sister, missed the simple joys of home. She walked toward Beatrice, feeling the weight of her bag. But more than that, the weight of the years lifting off her shoulders as she stepped onto familiar soil. "Welcome home," Beatrice said softly as she wrapped her arms around Maggie. It felt like the world was finally aligning, like everything was meant to be. Maggie didn't have the words to explain it, but as she hugged Beatrice, she realized that the dream of coming home, of finding peace, of rediscovering herself, had finally come true. The platform was quiet, save for the faint whisper of the wind brushing through the trees. Maggie stood still, absorbing the familiar sights around her, trying to commit every detail to memory. The old stone buildings that lined the streets, the little church on the hill, and the cobbled paths that wound through the village all seemed to be suspended in time. For a fleeting moment, it felt as though she had stepped into a memory. This place that had once been her world now seemed so distant, yet so close at the same time. The snow, soft and unrelenting, continued to fall around her like a blanket, its flakes catching the dim light of the station lanterns. "Maggie, come on. Let's get you settled in." Beatrice's voice cut through the quiet. Maggie looked over at her sister, who stood by the platform with a broad smile on her face, her breath visible in the cold air. Beatrice looked unchanged, though Maggie could see the faint lines of age beginning to soften the youthful features she had once known so well. She wore a thick woolen coat, a scarf wrapped snugly around her neck, her hands clutching the handle of a weathered suitcase. "Are you sure you're not freezing?" Maggie asked, walking toward her. She knew the winter chill could cut through to your bones in this part of the world. But her sister stood there as if it didn't bother her at all. Beatrice chuckled. "I've lived here all my life, Maggie. A little cold won't hurt me." Her eyes sparkled as she reached out to pull Maggie into a warm embrace. "It's so good to have you back," she said softly, squeezing her tightly. Maggie held on to her for a moment, savoring the sensation of familiarity. Beatrice's arms felt like home, something she hadn't realized she had been yearning for. The past decades of travel, the bustling cities, and the endless cycle of new faces and places suddenly seemed so far away. Here, with Beatrice, standing in the place where they had grown up, everything felt more grounded. She inhaled the cold air, the scent of pine and earth filling her lungs. For the first time in years, Maggie felt like she could breathe again. "I'm not sure I even recognize this place anymore," Maggie admitted, pulling back to look at the village around her. The houses, the fields, even the roads seemed smaller than she remembered. She had been gone for so long that even her memories felt distant. "It's all so much quieter than I expected." Beatrice nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "It's always been quiet here, Maggie, but it's home, and it will always be home no matter how much time passes." Maggie took in the village once more, trying to shake off the feeling that everything was a dream. The streets were dusted in snow, the lights from the windows of nearby houses casting a soft glow across the snow-covered streets. There was something magical about it all, something that made the world feel still, as though time had forgotten to move forward in this tiny village. It was as if the years Maggie had spent away from here had never existed, and she was simply coming back to the life she had left behind. Beatrice led the way down the familiar cobbled path, their footsteps crunching in the snow. The walk to the house felt shorter than Maggie remembered, though she knew it was only because the distance between them was now filled with years, memories, and emotions. The old house, the one she had left behind, stood at the end of the path. It was just as she remembered it. A two-story building, ivy creeping up the sides, the weathered shutters hanging crookedly by the windows, and the warmth of the hearth visible through the small panes of glass. Beatrice opened the gate and gestured for Maggie to enter. "Welcome home," she said with a smile. Maggie walked through the gate, the snow crunching beneath her boots as she made her way up the small walkway to the front door. The house, though old and weathered, held a certain charm that made it feel like a safe haven, a place untouched by the world outside. Inside, the familiar scents of baked goods and the soft crackle of the fire welcomed her. The house was warm, and despite the years that had passed, it felt just as it had when she was a child. The wooden floors, worn down by time and use, creaked as Maggie stepped into the living room. The large stone fireplace was the centerpiece, its flames dancing merrily. Beatrice's husband, Harold, sat in a nearby armchair, his feet propped up on the ottoman as he read a book. He looked up and smiled at Maggie, his expression kind but slightly puzzled. "Long time no see," he said, setting the book aside and standing to greet her. Maggie smiled warmly. "It's been too long, Harold. How have you been?" "Keeping busy," he replied, his voice warm. He was a quiet man, not given to much conversation, but Maggie always appreciated his steady, calm presence. He was the type of person who didn't need to say much to be understood. "We've missed you." Beatrice stepped toward the fireplace, poking the logs to keep the flames alive. "Dinner will be ready in a bit, Maggie. You must be starving after that long trip." Maggie felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She was starving, both for food and for the connection to this place. "Thank you," she said, sitting on the couch next to Harold. Her eyes drifted around the room, taking in the familiar objects that filled it. The old oak shelves stacked with books, the cozy armchairs, the thick woolen blankets draped over the backs of sofas. This house, with all its simple comforts, was a symbol of something Maggie had longed for, but hadn't known how to find. "Do you remember how we used to sit by the fire after dinner?" Beatrice asked, joining them on the couch, her voice soft. "Dad would read to us, and we'd listen to the wind howling outside. It feels like it was just yesterday." Maggie nodded, the memories rushing back like a flood. Christmases spent around this very hearth, the way her father's voice would rise and fall as he read stories to them, the way the firelight would cast dancing shadows on the walls. It all seemed so alive in her memory, though it had been years since she had felt the warmth of those moments. "You've got to tell me all about your travels," Beatrice continued, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Where have you been? What have you seen? I can't wait to hear all about it." Maggie hesitated, unsure of how to start. The years she had spent away from this place were not something she liked to revisit often. They were filled with loneliness, uncertainty, and a constant search for something she couldn't name. But now, sitting here in this warm room with her sister and Harold, she realized that maybe it was time to let go of some of those burdens. "I've been to a lot of places," Maggie began slowly, her voice quieter than usual. "I've seen the world in ways I never expected to. But it didn't feel like home. I thought it would. I thought I needed to get away from all of this, but now—" She trailed off, her words hanging in the air. Beatrice looked at her with understanding. "You've been running," she said softly. "And now you're here, Maggie. You're home." Maggie swallowed the lump that had formed in her throat. She had never expected such clarity, but in that moment she realized that Beatrice was right. She had been running for so long, and now, finally, she had returned, not just to the house or the village, but to herself. The evening passed in a quiet haze of laughter, stories, and the comforting presence of family. Maggie felt herself beginning to relax, the tension that had built up over the years slowly unwinding. As they ate dinner together, the conversation flowed easily. It was as though no time had passed at all. But deep inside, Maggie knew that this was just the beginning of something much larger than she could have anticipated. This place, this house, these people, they were her foundation, the roots she had long ago planted, and now in her return were beginning to take hold once more. The following days in the village passed by slowly, each one blending into the next as Maggie sank deeper into the rhythm of home. It was an odd feeling, familiar yet foreign. She had been back for almost a week now, but the sensation of truly being here, of truly settling back into this life, still felt like a dream. There were moments when she would look out the window at the snow falling gently on the ground, the bare trees silhouetted against the pale sky, and she would feel as though time had been suspended, as though she had never left. It wasn't that she didn't feel welcome. Beatrice and Harold had gone out of their way to make her feel at home, perhaps even a bit too much, but Maggie couldn't bring herself to complain. The house was warm, the food was plentiful, and the quiet comfort of the village seeped into her like a balm. The sound of the wind outside, the whispers of the trees, the fire crackling in the hearth, it all settled deep within her bones. But there was still a feeling that lingered, an unspoken question that Maggie couldn't quite shake. What was she truly looking for here? The mornings were slow. Beatrice would often rise early to bake bread or prepare the morning meal, the scent of freshly ground coffee filling the house as Maggie stretched lazily, awakening to the warmth of the fire and the quiet of the village outside. They would talk over breakfast, laughing at small jokes and memories of their childhood. But despite the outward ease of their interaction, Maggie couldn't escape the thoughts that swirled in her mind. She had lived for so long in the chaos of other places, cities, bustling streets, new faces, unfamiliar languages. Even the quiet places she had stayed, mountain cabins, remote cottages, had always felt like temporary stops, fleeting moments in the larger journey of her life. But here, in the village, everything felt different. It was as though the world had slowed down, asking her to take a breath, to stay, to be still. And yet, despite this calm, Maggie found it difficult to let go of the constant hum of life that had followed her for so long. On the morning of the 5th day, Beatrice suggested a walk. "I think you need to see the village properly," she said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "There's a little cafe by the square, and I'm sure you'd love the hot chocolate they serve there. It's the best you'll ever taste." Maggie smiled and agreed. She had spent most of her days holed up in the house, either reading by the fire or wandering aimlessly around the familiar rooms, but she realized it had been far too long since she had taken a proper stroll around the village. They bundled up in layers of thick coats, scarves, and gloves, stepping out into the crisp air. The village square was a short walk away, and as they approached, Maggie felt a sense of nostalgia wash over her. The shops, though quaint, looked just as they had in her memories. Old buildings with wooden shutters, stone facades, and windows lit with the soft, golden glow of lamps. The bell tower of the church could be seen in the distance, towering above the rooftops, its bells ringing faintly in the background. The street was relatively quiet, save for a few people walking by, bundled up in coats and hats, carrying baskets or small parcels. Maggie had forgotten how peaceful it was here, how people moved with purpose, but without the urgency she had grown accustomed to in the cities. There was a certain slowness to it, an intentionality in the way life was lived. Beatrice led her to the small cafe, its window fogged up from the warmth inside. A tiny bell jingled as they entered, and the owner, a woman with rosy cheeks and a bright smile, greeted them warmly. The cafe was cozy, with a wooden counter lined with pastries and cakes, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and chocolate filling the air. Maggie took a deep breath, letting the familiar smell fill her senses. She had missed this small-town warmth. There was something so comforting about the simplicity of it all. It was a stark contrast to the flashy coffee shops in the cities where everything felt rushed and impersonal. "2 of your best hot chocolates, please," Beatrice said, as she took a seat at a small table by the window. Maggie followed suit, settling down in the chair across from her. The small cafe felt like a haven, a quiet escape from the world, even if just for a moment. Maggie looked out the window, watching as a few snowflakes drifted lazily to the ground. "This place hasn't changed at all, has it?" she asked, turning to Beatrice. Beatrice shook her head, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Some things don't change, Maggie. Some things are just meant to stay the same." She paused before adding, "And that's okay, you know? Not everything needs to move forward all the time." Maggie nodded, her gaze still focused on the falling snow. There was truth in Beatrice's words. Maggie had always been someone who looked forward, who was always chasing after the next adventure, the next thrill, the next place. She had never allowed herself to just stop and enjoy the stillness, to be content with the present moment. But now, in the quiet of this village, with the soft crackling fire in the background, the world outside felt both distant and near. The present moment felt enough, even if she hadn't quite figured out what that meant yet. The hot chocolate arrived in thick, steaming mugs, topped with whipped cream and a sprinkle of cocoa powder. The rich, creamy sweetness filled her mouth, and for a moment Maggie closed her eyes, savoring the taste. There was something almost magical about food when it was shared with family, in a place like this. Simple, yet deeply comforting. After a while, Beatrice grew quiet, and Maggie could sense the subtle shift in her sister's mood. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when Beatrice would ask her why she had come back. Maggie had avoided this conversation since her arrival, not knowing how to explain the feelings that had brought her here. She wasn't sure herself. But now, sitting in this warm cafe, with the soft sound of the wind outside and the silence of the snow, Maggie knew it was time to confront the questions she had been avoiding. "I've been running, Bea," Maggie said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't meant to say it aloud, but the words spilled out before she could stop them. "Running from something I couldn't figure out. I thought if I kept moving, if I kept traveling, I would find whatever it was I was looking for. But now I'm here, and I still don't know what it is." Beatrice reached across the table, placing her hand over Maggie's. The warmth of her touch felt like a reassurance. "You don't need to have all the answers, Maggie. Not everything needs to be figured out right now. The most important thing is that you're here, with us. You've come home." Maggie let out a shaky breath, feeling the weight of the words in the air. Coming home. That was exactly what it felt like, and yet she was still unsure of what that meant for her future. Could she really let go of the life she had built in the cities? Could she really settle down in this quiet village, surrounded by people she had once known, but who now felt like strangers? Before she could respond, Beatrice changed the subject, her voice playful once again. "How about we take a walk to the church after this? You know, just like we used to do after school, when you dragged me to every single corner of this village to get out of doing your homework." Maggie chuckled at the memory, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing. Beatrice had always known how to lighten the mood, how to bring them back to those small, simple moments that made life feel less complicated. They finished their hot chocolates and made their way out into the snow, strolling down the village paths, side by side. As they approached the church, Maggie couldn't help but feel the weight of the question still lingering in her heart. She wasn't sure what her future held, or if she could ever truly stop running. But for the first time in years, she felt as though she was beginning to understand what it meant to truly be home. The mornings had settled into a rhythm, one that Maggie had not anticipated but had come to cherish. There was something grounding about the slow mornings, the quiet conversations, and the constant hum of family life that soothed the restlessness inside her. It was almost as though the village itself was a balm to her weary spirit, offering a sense of peace that she had long been seeking but never truly found. Each day, as Maggie wandered the quiet streets with Beatrice, the weight of the years she had spent running began to lift, bit by bit. But with every moment of comfort, there were also reminders of the past, small details that brought back memories of a time long gone. On the third evening of her stay, after a hearty dinner of roasted chicken and potatoes, Beatrice suggested they take a walk down to the lake. The idea of it filled Maggie with a sense of nostalgia she couldn't quite explain. It had been years since she had stood at the edge of the water, watching the reflection of the trees and the sky blend together like a painting. It had been a place of peace and solitude for her as a child, a place to dream, to think, and to escape from the world when things felt too overwhelming. Maggie and Beatrice bundled up in their thick winter coats and scarves, stepping out into the cold night air. The snow was heavier now, the sky a soft shade of gray, and the village streets were eerily quiet. As they made their way down the path toward the lake, Maggie felt the familiar sting of the cold against her cheeks, but it was a welcome feeling. It reminded her of the winters she had spent here, of the long evenings spent by the fire, of the gentle rhythm of life that had always seemed to be a part of her. It was all so simple, so pure, and yet she had turned her back on it, convinced that the world outside was where she needed to be. The lake shimmered in the distance, its surface smooth and still. The trees that lined its shores were bare now, their branches reaching up toward the sky like the bony fingers of some ancient being. As they approached, the stillness of the place washed over Maggie like a wave. It felt like the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She had missed this place, missed the way it allowed her to clear her mind and just be. Beatrice, ever the dreamer, took a seat on a nearby rock, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. She looked out over the water, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "I remember when we used to come here after school," she said softly. "You would sit by the water for hours, staring at the reflection of the trees. I always thought you were waiting for something." Maggie sat beside her, pulling her knees up to her chest. The memory of those days was sharp, as though they had happened only yesterday. The world had seemed so much simpler then. "I was waiting for something," Maggie said, her voice quiet, almost as though speaking the words out loud would make them more real. "I didn't know what it was, but I was waiting. I think I still am." Beatrice turned to her, her eyes soft with understanding. "You've spent so many years searching, Maggie. Maybe it's time to stop waiting for something and start living for what's right in front of you." The words stung, but in a way that felt cleansing, like a truth she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. She had spent so many years looking for something outside of herself, thinking that happiness and fulfillment were places she could find in faraway lands, in new experiences, in the unfamiliar. But now, sitting by this lake, with the snow falling softly around her and her sister by her side, Maggie realized that maybe the thing she had been searching for had always been here, in the stillness, in the quiet, in the very place she had once called home. They sat in silence for a long while, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional splash of water against the rocks filling the space between them. Maggie felt herself growing heavier with the weight of realization. For so long, she had been running from this place, from this life, convinced that she needed to escape in order to find what she was searching for. But now, as she looked out over the lake, she could feel the pull of something deeper, something that had always been there, but that she had never fully embraced. "I think I'm finally starting to understand," Maggie said quietly, her voice almost a whisper in the stillness of the night. "I've spent so much time searching for the next big adventure, the next place, the next experience. But maybe the adventure was always here. It was in this village, in this home, with you." Beatrice smiled, her eyes soft with warmth. "I'm glad you're starting to see that, Maggie. There's so much life here, so much to hold on to. It's not always about running away. Sometimes it's about staying, about appreciating what's right in front of you." They sat there for a while longer, the night stretching out around them, the only sounds the whispers of the wind and the distant call of a night bird. As they finally stood and made their way back to the house, Maggie felt a sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, or how long she would stay in this village, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could breathe. The next morning, Maggie awoke early, the soft light of dawn filtering through the windows. She stretched and let out a yawn, feeling the pleasant soreness in her muscles from the previous day's walk. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of Beatrice humming in the kitchen as she prepared breakfast. Maggie got out of bed and made her way downstairs, drawn by the familiar scent of freshly baked bread and the warm comfort of the fire crackling in the hearth. Beatrice was busy setting the table, her back to the door. "You're up early," Maggie remarked, stepping into the kitchen. Beatrice turned and smiled. "I'm always up early. There's something peaceful about the morning hours." She set the last of the plates on the table and then turned to Maggie. "How are you feeling today?" Maggie paused, thinking about the walk by the lake, about the conversation they had shared, and about everything that had happened since her arrival. "I think I'm starting to feel like myself again," she said softly. "Like I'm beginning to come home, not just to the village, but to who I am." Beatrice's smile widened. "I'm glad to hear that. It's good to see you finding your way back." They sat down to breakfast, the conversation flowing easily between them. As they ate, Maggie realized that this was what she had been missing all along. The quiet moments, the shared meals, the feeling of being grounded in a place that was familiar and safe. There was a certain rhythm to life here, a rhythm she had been searching for but had never known how to find. But now, sitting at this table with Beatrice, Maggie understood. The gift of the present, of simply being here, of being home, was the greatest adventure she could have ever hoped for. Later that afternoon, as they walked to the village center to do some shopping, Maggie felt a sense of contentment settle over her. She wasn't sure what the future held or what would come next, but she knew that she was no longer searching for something she couldn't define. For the first time in a long while, she felt as though she was exactly where she needed to be. And for the first time in many years, Maggie felt at peace. The days continued to stretch out before Maggie like a canvas, and with each one, the brush strokes of her life became more defined. The once unfamiliar village began to feel less like a place of exile, and more like a sanctuary, a refuge she hadn't known she was searching for. The mornings were still slow, but now Maggie found herself savoring the rhythm of village life. The soft hum of birds outside the window, the low murmur of voices as neighbors exchanged greetings on their way to the market, the rustling of leaves in the quiet wind that whispered through the trees. It was a gentle kind of chaos, a natural flow that didn't demand anything from her, but the willingness to simply be. After a long day of errands and small talk with the villagers, Maggie found herself enjoying the strolls through the countryside that had once been part of her daily life. There was a solitude to the walks, but a comfort in knowing that there was always someone nearby, always a smile to greet her. She had forgotten how small-town life had its own kind of rhythm, a way of moving that wasn't rushed or harsh, but soft and steady, like a river carving its way through rock. On one particular afternoon, after finishing a simple lunch of soup and fresh bread with Beatrice, Maggie decided to take a longer walk to the nearby orchard. The trees were bare now, their leaves gone, but Maggie had always loved the sight of the tall, winding branches against the pale winter sky. As she walked, the crunch of snow beneath her boots was the only sound that accompanied her, and she felt as though she were stepping into a world of her own, away from the pressures of life, away from the memories of what had been. The orchard was quiet, the air crisp and clean. Maggie stopped for a moment to gaze at the bare trees, their gnarled branches twisting in odd shapes, reaching out toward the sky like longing hands. There was something hauntingly beautiful about the orchard in winter, something that stirred an ache in her chest. A reminder of how much time had passed since she had truly allowed herself to slow down and appreciate the world around her. As Maggie stood there, her hands tucked into her pockets for warmth, she heard a sound. Soft footsteps crunching through the snow behind her. She turned to see a familiar figure approaching, her sister Beatrice, who had followed her out for no other reason than to enjoy the quiet afternoon together. "I thought I might find you here," Beatrice said, her voice soft but filled with affection. She had a way of speaking that made everything feel safe, as though nothing could harm them here, in this world they had built for themselves. Maggie smiled, a small, wistful smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's beautiful here, so quiet." Beatrice nodded, stepping up beside her. "It's always been my favorite place, There's something about the stillness that makes it easy to think. She paused, glancing at Maggie. You've been doing a lot of thinking, haven't you? Maggie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took in the scene before her. The orchard, the sky, the rolling hills in the distance, dusted with snow. The stillness felt heavy, like a weight in the air. It wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was simply present. And in that moment, Maggie realized just how much she had needed it. I've been thinking about a lot of things, Maggie finally said, her voice quiet. About where I've been and why I left all those years ago. About what I was running from. I don't know if I'll ever have all the answers, but I think I'm starting to understand that maybe I wasn't running from something at all. Maybe I was running towards something. Beatrice didn't say anything at first. She simply stood beside her, her presence steady and calming. After a moment, she reached out and placed her hand on Maggie's arm. You're not alone in this, Maggie, she said, her voice filled with a warmth that made Maggie's heart flutter. Whatever it is you're searching for, you don't have to do it alone. We've got each other, and that's enough for now. Maggie looked at her sister, seeing the kindness in her eyes, the understanding that had always existed between them, no matter how much time had passed. In that moment, Maggie realized that home wasn't just a place, it was a feeling, a connection to the people you loved, to the memories you cherished, and to the moments that grounded you in the present. They stood there together for a while, side by side, taking in the beauty of the orchard, the quiet of the village, and the soft light of the winter afternoon. The snow had begun to fall again, light flakes drifting from the sky and adding to the soft blanket already covering the ground. It was as if the world itself were offering them a moment of peace, a brief respite from the questions that had been chasing Maggie for years. After a time, Beatrice nudged Maggie with her elbow, a mischievous grin on her face. Come on, let's head back home. I'm sure there's something delicious waiting for us. Maggie laughed, the sound light and carefree. You always think about food. It's one of life's great joys, Beatrice replied with a wink. Besides, I think you're starting to appreciate the simple things again, just like you should. Maggie smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. It was true. She had been so consumed with the idea of finding herself and the pressure of living up to expectations that she had forgotten how to simply be. To be present, to embrace the small moments, and to allow herself to enjoy the things that made life sweet. Food, laughter, the company of those who loved her. Those were the simple joys that made the world worth living in. They walked back to the house, the air crisp and fresh, the snowflakes drifting gently around them. As they approached the warm glow of the windows, Maggie felt something inside her settle, as though a piece of the puzzle of her life had finally clicked into place. She wasn't sure where her journey would lead her, or what would come next, but for the first time in years, she felt a sense of contentment, a deep peace that had been missing for far too long. Later that evening, as they sat around the table for dinner, surrounded by the soft glow of candlelight and the warmth of the hearth, Maggie felt a quiet joy settle over her. There was no rushing, no overwhelming sense of urgency. It was just her, Beatrice, and the simple pleasure of being together. In that moment, Maggie realized that home wasn't just about a place. It was about being present, about cherishing the people and the moments that truly mattered. She wasn't running anymore. She was here. And for the first time in a long time, Maggie felt that this was exactly where she was meant to be. The days in the village felt more and more like a gentle tide that Maggie had learned to float along with. The weeks drifted by in a series of soft rhythms, morning walks, quiet dinners, afternoons spent sitting by the fire with a cup of tea. It wasn't a life full of excitement or grandeur, but it was grounded in something Maggie hadn't realized she'd been missing. A sense of belonging. She had spent so many years searching for meaning in distant places, in the hustle of cities, and in the pursuit of fleeting dreams. But now, with the snow blanketing the village and the warmth of her sister's company filling the house, Maggie had begun to realize that the peace she had been yearning for had always been within her reach. On this particular morning, Maggie woke early, as the soft light of dawn peeked through the curtains. She pulled herself out of bed, the familiar ache of the cold air greeting her, and patted down the creaky wooden steps to the kitchen. As she entered, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon rolls filled the air, drawing her toward the warm glow of the stove where Beatrice was busy at work. "Morning," Maggie said, her voice still heavy with sleep, but filled with a contentment she hadn't known in years. Beatrice turned with a smile, a flower-covered apron tied around her waist. "Morning, sleepyhead," she teased. "You're up early today." Maggie shrugged, running a hand through her hair. "I couldn't sleep much last night. My mind was just racing with thoughts." Beatrice set the spoon down and moved toward Maggie, placing a warm hand on her shoulder. "Want to talk about it?" Maggie hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I think I'm just trying to figure it all out, Bea. My past, everything I've been running from. I've been thinking a lot about the choices I made, the things I left behind, and the life I thought I had to create somewhere else. But now that I'm here, I feel like it's all coming back in pieces, and I'm not sure if I can put it all together again." Beatrice smiled softly, leading Maggie over to the table where the cinnamon rolls were cooling. "You don't have to put it all together right now. You're here now, and that's enough. It's not about having it all figured out. It's about being where you are and letting everything unfold at its own pace. That's how life works sometimes. It unfolds slowly, like the morning light." Maggie sat down at the table, watching as Beatrice brought over 2 steaming mugs of coffee, placing one in front of her. The warmth of the cup felt soothing in her hands, grounding her in the present moment. She took a sip and closed her eyes, letting the comforting flavor fill her senses. "You're right," Maggie said quietly, her voice full of quiet reflection. "I've been trying so hard to figure out where I went wrong, to chase down every loose end of my life. But maybe I've been looking in all the wrong places. Maybe it's about looking inward and not so much about fixing everything that's happened." Beatrice nodded, her eyes soft. "Life isn't about fixing things, Maggie. It's about accepting that things aren't always perfect, but they are what they are, and they lead us to where we need to be. And where you need to be, right now, is here, with us. With me." Maggie smiled at her sister's words, feeling a lump form in her throat. It had been years since she had heard such simple, honest comfort. She had spent so long running from her past, from the hurt, from the disappointments and heartbreaks that had come along the way. But sitting at the kitchen table with the warmth of the house and Beatrice's steady presence, Maggie began to feel that maybe, just maybe, it was all going to be okay. Over the following days, Maggie continued to settle into her life at the village. Each morning felt like a new beginning, and the more she allowed herself to embrace the stillness and simplicity of her surroundings, the more she found herself reconnecting with the parts of her soul she had abandoned for so long. There was an ease to the days now, a gentleness that came from living within the rhythm of nature, of the earth beneath her feet, and the sky above her head. One evening, after dinner, Beatrice invited Maggie to join her in the garden, where they could sit under the stars. They wrapped themselves in blankets, pulled their chairs close to the edge of the garden, and watched the night sky unfold before them. The winter sky was clear and vast, filled with countless stars that twinkled like diamonds scattered across a black velvet backdrop. Maggie looked up, a soft sigh escaping her lips as she let the beauty of it all wash over her. "I haven't done this in so long," Maggie said, her voice soft, almost reverent. "Just watch the stars. When I was younger, I used to sit outside for hours, just looking up, dreaming. I think I forgot how to do that." Beatrice smiled and took Maggie's hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to dream about far-off places anymore. You're here, Maggie. You've already come home." The words hung in the air between them, full of meaning and emotion that Maggie wasn't quite ready to unpack. But they felt like truth. A truth she had been avoiding for years. She had spent so much time chasing dreams of what she thought life should be. But now, sitting under the vast expanse of stars, she realized that she had been living a dream all along. It just hadn't looked like the one she expected. "I think I've been trying to outrun myself," Maggie said, the realization dawning on her as she looked up at the stars. "But maybe that's the thing, Bea. I don't need to outrun myself. I just need to accept who I am and who I've become. Maybe I don't need to chase after some perfect life anymore. Maybe I just need to live the one that's right in front of me." Beatrice nodded, her eyes soft and understanding. "You're not alone in this, Maggie. You never have been." Maggie felt the tears welling up in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of letting go of everything that had been weighing her down. She had spent so many years thinking she had to be something else, that she wasn't enough as she was. But now, sitting under the stars with Beatrice, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the village, Maggie realized that she had always been enough. She had just needed to believe in herself. As the night wore on, they sat together, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars. And for the first time in a long time, Maggie felt a deep sense of peace settle over her, one that came not from running or chasing or striving for something more, but from simply being here. In this moment, with the people she loved, in the place she was meant to be. The quiet unfolding of the soul had begun, and Maggie knew that, for the first time in a long time, she was exactly where she needed to be. The days had begun to grow longer, and the first signs of spring were slowly starting to break through the winter chill. It was still cold, but there was something different in the air now, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. The snow was melting, and the earth beneath it was beginning to breathe again. It felt like the world itself was waking up from a long slumber, just as Maggie had been. Every morning, as Maggie stepped outside, she felt the change in the air. The crispness of winter was being replaced by the promise of something new, something alive. It was the same feeling she had when she first arrived in the village, when she had stepped off the train and felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. But now, it wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was the steady heartbeat of life that had begun to flow through her veins. Beatrice had noticed the change too. The sparkle in Maggie's eyes was back. The quiet joy that had been absent for so long was slowly returning. It was a healing that couldn't be rushed, but rather one that unfolded at its own pace, much like the seasons themselves. Every time they sat together, whether over tea, while they cooked, or simply in silence, Maggie felt a little more at peace, a little more whole. On one particularly beautiful afternoon, Beatrice suggested that they take a trip to the nearby lake. The idea of spending time outside, surrounded by nature, was something Maggie had come to cherish. So they gathered their coats and scarves, packed a small picnic, and set off together. The walk to the lake was short, but it was peaceful. The ground beneath their feet was soft from the melting snow, and the air was filled with the sounds of birds returning after the long winter. As they approached the water, Maggie felt a rush of nostalgia wash over her. The lake, though still frozen at the edges, was one she had visited often as a child. She had forgotten just how much she loved it. The quiet, the way the water seemed to shimmer with possibility even when it was still. They sat on a bench by the water's edge, the soft sound of the wind rustling through the trees the only sound breaking the silence. Beatrice pulled out a thermos of hot chocolate, and the two of them sipped it slowly, letting the warmth fill them. There was something comforting about these quiet moments, and Maggie was beginning to realize just how much she had missed them. "Do you remember when we used to come here as kids?" Maggie asked, her voice quiet as she stared at the water. "I used to dream about all sorts of things, about the future, about the person I thought I was going to be." Beatrice smiled softly, looking out at the lake with her sister. "I remember. You always had big dreams, Maggie. You always thought there was something out there waiting for you, something grand and exciting." Maggie let out a soft laugh. "I guess I was always chasing something, but I think I forgot how to appreciate the small things, the moments like this, sitting here with you, with no grand expectations, just being. I think I'm finally starting to understand that the future I was chasing was never as important as the life I'm living right now." Beatrice turned to Maggie, her eyes filled with understanding. "You've always been looking for something, Maggie. But maybe what you've been searching for has been right here all along. Maybe it's not about finding something new, but about remembering what you already have, and about healing." Maggie felt the words settle deep inside her, like a truth she had been avoiding for years. "I think I've spent so much time running from things I didn't want to face, from the hurt, from the past, from the guilt I felt for leaving. But I see now that healing isn't about running away. It's about facing those things, accepting them, and letting them go." Beatrice nodded, a quiet smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Exactly. Healing is a process. It doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't always look the way we think it will. But it happens, bit by bit, moment by moment. And sometimes, the most healing thing we can do is simply allow ourselves to be where we are, in this moment." The afternoon stretched on, the sun beginning to dip low in the sky, casting a golden glow across the water. The lake, which had once seemed so still and unchanging, now felt alive with possibility, just like Maggie. There was no rush, no need to move forward too quickly. Life had a way of unfolding in its own time, and Maggie was learning to let it. As they packed up to leave, Maggie looked at Beatrice, a deep sense of gratitude in her heart. "Thank you," she said softly, "for being here with me, for letting me find my way back." Beatrice reached out and squeezed her hand. "You don't need to thank me, Maggie. I've always been here, and I'll always be here. You're not alone in this." They walked back to the village, the air cooler now, the first stars beginning to appear in the sky. Maggie felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying. There was something freeing in the act of simply being. No expectations, no pressure. Just living in the moment and allowing the healing to come naturally. That night, as they sat around the dinner table, Maggie felt a quiet peace settle over her. The evening was calm, the fire crackling softly in the background, and the aroma of Beatrice's cooking filling the house with warmth. It was simple, but it was enough. It was everything. As the meal ended and the dishes were cleared away, Beatrice suggested they take a walk around the village, just to enjoy the night air. Maggie agreed, and the two of them walked together through the empty streets, the quiet of the evening wrapping around them like a blanket. "Sometimes I think we forget how much healing comes from the people around us," Maggie said, her voice thoughtful. "I've spent so many years trying to do it all alone, trying to figure everything out on my own. But it's the people who love us, who hold us when we're falling apart, who really help us heal." Beatrice smiled softly, a warmth in her gaze. "We all need each other, Maggie. That's what family is for, to remind us of who we are when we've forgotten, to help us pick up the pieces when we can't do it ourselves." Maggie felt a tear slip down her cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release, of acceptance. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was where she was supposed to be. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't searching for answers outside herself. She had everything she needed right here: her sister, her home, and a life that was finally beginning to feel whole again. The walk ended at the small park where they had first arrived, and as they sat down on a bench, Maggie took a deep breath, looking out at the quiet, star-filled sky. She knew the journey wasn't over, that there was still more to learn and discover. But for the first time in a long time, Maggie felt like she had found her way home. The early days of spring had softened the harshness of winter, and Maggie found herself waking to the gentle light of mornings filled with new energy. The air was crisp but inviting, carrying with it the smell of earth and fresh growth. It was a time of transition, not just for the land around her, but for herself. The flowers were blooming, the trees were starting to bud, and Maggie felt herself blooming too, slowly, carefully, but with a new sense of purpose she had never known before. She spent her days settling into the rhythm of village life, gradually finding comfort in the simple, quiet moments. Every corner of the village was a reminder of her childhood. The old oak tree by the familiar scent of pine that lingered in the air after a rainstorm, the sight of children running through the streets playing games. It was all part of a story Maggie had once been a part of, and now, returning to it, she began to realize how much she had missed. It wasn't just the village that had changed, though. Maggie had changed too. The woman who had left this place all those years ago was not the same person who had returned. She had spent so many years in the city, chasing a version of herself that was always just out of reach. She had tried to fill the emptiness with accomplishments, with new experiences, with endless distractions. But in the end, none of that had been enough to fill the hole in her heart, the part of herself that had been left behind in her childhood. Sitting at the kitchen table one morning, with a cup of tea in hand, Maggie thought back to those years, the dreams she had as a young girl, the hopes for a life that seemed so far away. She had been ambitious, eager to prove herself to the world, to escape her past and make something of herself. But now, after everything that had happened, she realized that the escape had only taken her farther from who she truly was. "I never thought I'd come back here," she said aloud, more to herself than to Beatrice, who was bustling about in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Beatrice glanced over at her, a knowing look on her face. "I think you always knew you would. It was just a matter of when. Some things are meant to come full circle, Maggie. Life has a funny way of bringing us back to where we started." Maggie sat back in her chair, staring into the steaming cup of tea. "I never thought I'd come back, but now that I am, it feels like I've come home to myself too. Like everything I was searching for was always here, in this place, in this life. I don't know if that makes any sense." "It makes perfect sense," Beatrice replied, her voice warm and understanding. "Sometimes we have to go far away in order to realize that what we were looking for was never out there. It was within us all along. And sometimes the journey isn't about finding something new. It's about returning to the things we've lost along the way." Maggie nodded slowly, letting her sister's words sink in. It wasn't just the physical return to the village that was important. It was the emotional return to herself. The woman who had left this place had been full of dreams and ambitions, but she had also been full of fear. Fear of failure, fear of not being good enough, fear of facing the things she had buried deep within her. But now, sitting in the warmth of the kitchen, surrounded by the love of her family, Maggie felt like she was finally letting go of those fears. It was a slow process, one that didn't come with clear answers or immediate solutions. Healing never did. But Maggie had learned to be patient with herself. She didn't need to have everything figured out. She just needed to take one step at a time. The days continued to unfold, and with each passing one, Maggie felt herself becoming more connected to the life she had returned to. She helped Beatrice in the garden, planting flowers and vegetables that would soon bloom and bear fruit. She took long walks through the village, reacquainting herself with the familiar faces of old friends and neighbors. They didn't ask her about the years she had spent away. They didn't question her decision to come back. They just accepted her, as if nothing had changed, as if she had never left. But Maggie knew that she had changed. She wasn't the same person who had once stood on the edge of the village, dreaming of a life she didn't fully understand. She had learned so much on her journey, about herself, about life, about the world. And now, as she stood here, back where it all began, she understood that this was where she was meant to be. This was the place that would allow her to heal, to grow, and to create a future that was not defined by fear, but by hope. One evening, after a long day in the garden, Maggie and Beatrice sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, and the air was still and peaceful. Maggie felt a deep sense of gratitude well up inside her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. She had found peace in the most unexpected of places, within herself and in the life she had once tried to escape. "I've been thinking about the future," Maggie said quietly, her voice soft as she gazed at the horizon. "It's hard not to with everything that's been happening, but I've realized something important. I don't need to have everything figured out. I don't need to plan for some perfect life, because I'm already living it. The future will come, but it doesn't need to be something I chase. It will unfold on its own." Beatrice smiled, her gaze warm and knowing. "You're exactly where you need to be, Maggie. The future will come, and you'll be ready for it when the time is right. But for now, just enjoy the moments. Enjoy being here, being with us." Maggie nodded, her heart full. She didn't have all the answers, and maybe she never would. But that was okay. Life wasn't about having everything in place. It was about living fully in the present moment, accepting the journey, and trusting that everything would unfold as it was meant to. As the stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, Maggie felt a sense of peace settle over her. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to walk it, one step at a time, with no fear, no regrets, just the simple joy of being where she was, home. As the days passed, the village became a tapestry of memories and possibilities for Maggie. She had learned to embrace the rhythms of the seasons, just as she was learning to embrace the ebb and flow of her own emotions. The crisp spring air and the sound of birds singing in the trees filled her with a sense of peace. But it was the simple, everyday moments that continued to shape her healing. The quiet mornings spent at the kitchen table with Beatrice, the long walks through the village streets, the laughter shared over dinner. It was in these moments, so ordinary yet extraordinary, that Maggie found her greatest joy. She had always been a seeker, chasing after something beyond her reach, believing that the next adventure, the next opportunity, the next accomplishment would finally bring her fulfillment. But now, sitting beside Beatrice on the porch in the cool evenings, watching the stars blink to life one by one, Maggie realized that the answer had always been within her. It wasn't about finding something new. It was about learning to be present, to be whole in the life she had. It was about accepting the love and support of those around her, and allowing herself to receive the gifts of peace and contentment. One afternoon, as the scent of fresh bread filled the air, Beatrice invited Maggie to join her in the garden. The sun was bright, casting a golden glow over the newly sprouted flowers and vegetables. Maggie felt a deep sense of gratitude as she looked at the earth so full of life and thought about how much she had once taken for granted. How often had she rushed through life, never stopping to truly appreciate the beauty of the world around her. They knelt together in the soil, planting seeds that would one day bloom. And as they worked, Maggie found herself opening up to her sister in ways she hadn't before. There was something healing in the rhythm of their work, the shared task that was both simple and profound. As Beatrice carefully placed the seeds into the ground, Maggie looked at her and asked, "Beatrice, how did you do it? How did you stay here all these years while I was chasing something else?" Beatrice paused, her hands covered in dirt, and smiled. "I stayed because I knew this was where I belonged. Not everyone finds their home in the same place, Maggie. Some people leave to find themselves, and others stay. But it's not about the physical place. It's about knowing what fills your heart. And sometimes you don't know that until you've been away for a long time." Maggie nodded, her mind turning over Beatrice's words. "I spent so many years trying to prove something, to myself, to others. I thought if I achieved certain things, I would feel complete. But now, I'm realizing that I was always complete. I was just afraid to believe it." Beatrice reached out and squeezed Maggie's hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "You're learning, Maggie. You're learning that it's okay to be who you are, without the need to constantly chase something. Life isn't a race. It's about the journey. And you've been on quite a journey." Maggie looked at her sister, a new understanding blooming in her heart. She had always admired Beatrice's quiet strength, her ability to stay grounded in the midst of life's challenges. But now she realized that Beatrice wasn't just strong because she stayed in one place. She was strong because she had the courage to embrace the present moment and trust in the life she had. That evening, after dinner, Beatrice and Maggie sat on the porch again, wrapped in blankets against the cool night air. The sky above was a canvas of stars and the village was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The stars seemed to shine brighter than ever, as if they too were part of the healing process, reminding Maggie that there was something larger than herself at work in the universe. "I've been thinking a lot about the past lately," Maggie said, her voice soft, "about the choices I made and the people I left behind. I think part of me always felt like I had to choose between the life I wanted and the life I had. I didn't know how to reconcile the two." Beatrice's voice was gentle. "You don't have to choose, Maggie. Your past is a part of who you are, but it doesn't define you. The life you had before is just one chapter in your story. You have the power to write the next chapter, to choose who you want to be. You don't need to hold on to the past in order to move forward. The past doesn't have to hold any power over you." Maggie looked out at the night sky, the constellations stretching across the heavens, and felt something shift deep within her. She realized that she had been holding on to the past with both hands, unwilling to let go of the memories, the mistakes, the guilt. But Beatrice was right. She didn't need to carry that weight anymore. It was time to let go and make space for something new. "I've been so afraid of making mistakes," Maggie confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "But I think I've been afraid of the wrong thing. I've been afraid of living authentically, of facing the truth of who I am. But now I think I'm ready to embrace that." Beatrice smiled, her eyes filled with love and pride. "You've always been ready, Maggie. You just had to believe it yourself. And I'm so proud of you for getting to this point. You've come a long way." The night seemed to stretch on forever as the two sisters sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars above. Maggie felt a peace settle over her that she hadn't known in years. It was a peace born of acceptance of her past, her choices, and the woman she had become. But it was also a peace born of hope for the future, for what was yet to come. The journey wasn't over yet, but for the first time, Maggie felt like she was finally headed in the right direction. The next morning, as Maggie went about her daily routine, she began to feel a sense of anticipation in her heart. There was a subtle shift in the air, as if the world was telling her that something important was on the horizon. She didn't know what that something was, but she felt it deep in her bones. It was as if her life was no longer about waiting for something to happen. It was about actively participating in the life she was creating, moment by moment, choice by choice. That evening, as the sun set and the village settled into its quiet rhythm, Maggie found herself standing by the window, looking out at the horizon. She realized that she was no longer the same person who had arrived in this village months ago. She had shed her fears, her doubts, her insecurities. She had found a way to embrace the love of her family, to reconnect with her roots, and to finally live a life that was authentic and true to who she was. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. The unknown no longer felt like a threat. It felt like an opportunity, a blank page waiting to be filled. Maggie smiled softly to herself, knowing that whatever came next, she was ready. Maggie stood at the edge of the garden, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows over the newly sprouted vegetables and blooming flowers. The scent of earth and fresh blossoms mingled with the crisp air, and for a moment she closed her eyes and breathed it all in. It was the kind of peace she had once thought impossible, the kind of stillness that settled deep in your bones, wrapping you in a comfort so complete that you couldn't help but believe you had arrived exactly where you were meant to be. She had been in the village for several months now, enough time to truly feel the pull of its rhythms, to let the echoes of her past resonate and finally quiet down. Every corner of this village had stories embedded in it, stories of childhood dreams, of lessons learned, of moments that had shaped her. But now, standing here, Maggie realized that those stories, though valuable, did not have to define her. They were part of her, yes, but they no longer held the power to shape her future. The future was hers to create, and create it she would. Beatrice had been her rock, guiding her through the complexities of healing and helping her understand that she was not broken, just in need of rediscovery. The quiet mornings in the kitchen, the late-night talks on the porch, the shared laughter and occasional tears, they had become part of the tapestry of Maggie's new life, woven into the fabric of her being in ways that felt permanent, grounding. But it wasn't just Beatrice who had helped Maggie through this journey. It was the village itself, the land, the seasons, the people who had quietly welcomed her home. Even the elderly neighbors who had watched her grow up, their faces worn with the years, but their smiles still full of warmth, had been a source of quiet encouragement. It was as if, in returning to the place where she had begun, Maggie had been reintroduced to herself, a person who had once been full of dreams, full of life, and full of promise, before she had allowed herself to become lost in the hustle of the world. Now she understood what it meant to truly live, to live with intention, with purpose, and with the knowledge that every small choice mattered. It was no longer about achieving something for the sake of achievement. It was about living authentically, in alignment with her heart, her values, and the deep connection she now felt with the world around her. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village lights flickered to life one by one, Maggie felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life she had rediscovered. She no longer felt like an outsider looking in. She felt like she belonged, like she had always belonged, even when she didn't realize it. Beatrice had been talking for a while about the upcoming Christmas season, a celebration that was still weeks away, but felt like it was already lingering in the air. It was one of the most significant times of the year for their family, a time for gathering, for remembrance, and for celebration. It was a time when stories were shared around the fire, when laughter filled the house, and when the love that had always been between them became even more evident. "We'll have a big Christmas dinner this year," Beatrice had said one evening, a mischievous smile on her face. "The whole village will come over. It'll be like the old days." Maggie had smiled at that, knowing how much that idea meant to Beatrice. But there was something deeper in her sister's words, an understanding that this Christmas would be special in more ways than one. For Maggie, this would not just be a celebration of the season. It would be a celebration of her return, of the healing she had undergone, and of the life she had reclaimed. As the weeks passed, Maggie became involved in the preparations for the Christmas feast, helping Beatrice gather ingredients from the garden and assisting with the cooking. There was something profoundly fulfilling in the act of cooking together, the shared labor of preparing food for loved ones. It reminded Maggie of the simplicity of life, of the joy that could be found in these humble moments. The village, too, had begun to prepare for the holiday. Decorations appeared in windows, and the sound of carolers could be heard drifting through the streets. The familiar sense of pine and cinnamon filled the air, and Maggie found herself smiling at the thought of the community coming together once again. It was the kind of celebration she had yearned for when she was younger. Only now, it wasn't just about the holiday itself. It was about being fully present in the moments that mattered. The evening before Christmas Eve, Maggie found herself alone on the porch once again, watching the first snowfall of the season gently blanket the earth. She had a mug of warm cider in her hands, the steam curling up toward the crisp, clear night sky. The world seemed to have slowed, as if even the earth was taking a breath in preparation for what was to come. She thought about how far she had come in such a short time. She thought about the woman she had been when she arrived, the woman full of fear, full of hesitation, and compared her to the woman she was now. She had shed her old self, the one who was constantly searching for validation, for meaning. She had found it, not in faraway places or lofty achievements, but in the quiet, humble life she had rediscovered here, in this village, with the people who had always loved her. A soft knock on the door broke her reverie, and Maggie turned to see Beatrice standing there, her coat covered in snow, a smile on her face. "It's almost time," Beatrice said, her voice full of excitement. "The house is ready, the food is ready, and everyone will be here soon. Are you ready?" Maggie smiled, her heart full. "I'm ready." They embraced, the warmth of their shared love and the joy of the season wrapping around them like a blanket. And as they stood there, surrounded by the world that had helped heal her, Maggie knew that this was just the beginning. She had found her way back to the place she had always belonged, and in doing so, she had found a new path forward, a path that was full of love, connection, and a deep understanding of herself. Christmas Eve arrived, and the house was filled with laughter, with the sounds of voices raised in song, and with the aroma of a meal prepared with love. The community gathered around the table, their faces familiar, their hearts warm, and Maggie felt an overwhelming sense of belonging. She had come home, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. She had rediscovered the woman she had been, and in doing so had created a future that was full of promise. The next morning, as the sun rose over the village, Maggie stood at the window watching the snow fall softly. She knew that this Christmas would forever hold a special place in her heart. It wasn't just about the presents or the traditions. It was about the healing, the renewal, and the understanding that had come with it. She had finally found peace, and with that peace came a new beginning. A life lived with authenticity, with love, and with the understanding that the future was full of possibilities. Maggie smiled, knowing that this was the home she had been searching for all along. Not just a physical home, but a home within herself. A home filled with hope, love, and the quiet joy of living fully in the present. As the snow continued to fall, Maggie whispered a silent prayer of thanks to the universe, knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be. And in that moment, everything felt complete. Full circle. Thank you for joining us on Story Planet. If you felt the warmth of homecoming, if you discovered the joy of renewal, If the Christmas spirit touched your heart, consider giving a thumbs up. And if this story brought you comfort and quiet healing, share it with those who might need a moment of peace. Don't forget to subscribe for more gentle, soothing tales to drift into night after night. Wishing you warmth and peaceful dreams.